In every sport there is always the question of who is the absolute greatest, and in cyclocross that is no different. People will largely point to 3 people to being nominated as the greatest crossers of all time. In the past I've talked about Sven Nys and I've talked about Roland Liboton, but before them, the first undisputable king of cyclocross, dominating the sport across the 60s and 70s, was another Belgian, and his name was Erik de Vlaeminck. Erik Albrecht de Vlaeminck was born in Eeklo in northwestern Belgium on the 23rd of March 1945. He's the older of probably the 2 most talented brothers cycling has ever seen. Erik and his brother Roger de Vlaeminck, born in 1947, would dominate cross and road cycling respectively. Of course, growing up in the 50s and early 60s, it's quite hard to find a lot of information about either Erik or Roger. What we do know is that Erik was the first one to end up on the bike, and that his tale in cyclocross started in 1962. Erik de Vlaeminck's first cross results I've been able to track down date to 1962, a second place in the amateur cross of Middelkerke. This would make Erik likely 17 at the time, and he was already strong enough to fight for podiums. That's quite the talent. Throughout 1962, 63 and 64, Erik would compete in various races as a pro and as an amateur. I'm far too young to actually understand how cross would have intrinsically worked back then, but I imagine he wasn't the only one doing so. As an amateur, Erik won 3 crosses, in Berzele in 1962 and 63, and in 64 he won his home race in Eeklo. During the same 2-season period, Erik swept up 12 pro wins as well, finishing 7th and 4th at the Belgian Nationals, and in 1964 he would make his World Championship debut at 19, finishing 18th in Overboulare on the edge of Gerardsbergen. From 64-65 onwards, Erik would compete exclusively as a professional racer, racking up another 9 victories, including another win in Eeklo and the Luxembourgeois cross of Pétange. It would be at the age of 20, however, that de Vlaeminck would really make it big. He swept to 28 victories in a single season. Amongst his wins were another win in Eeklo, as well as the classics of Niel, Overijse and Steinmauer. Ever since his first breakthrough, Erik de Vlaeminck was known for his technical ability. The man is commonly called the most proficient bike handler of anyone ever. Once he honed these skills to perfection, he would start to become unstoppable. But he wasn't quite the big dog yet. In 1966, cross had 2 giants dominating the sport. Italy's 4-time world champion Renato Longo and triple world champion Rolf Wolfshall of Germany. In the Spanish town of Béziers, however, both would falter. Longo would crash early in the race, leaving Wolfshall with a young de Vlaeminck and Swiss outsider Hermann Gretner. Surprisingly, it was Wolfshall who would drop, de Vlaeminck eventually proving too strong for Gretner too, and a month before his 22nd birthday, Erik de Vlaeminck was the youngest world champion in cyclocross history, a record that would stand up until Marianne Vos took her first world title back in 2004. Only one man has ever worn the rainbow jersey at a younger age than de Vlaeminck. That man was Mathieu van der Poel, who was 21 when he took his first world title at Tabor in 2015. Erik de Vlaeminck would also be the first Belgian to be cyclocross world champion, setting off a long, illustrious history. In his first year in the Rainbow Bands, de Vlaeminck would take 18 victories, slowly finding his feet as world champion and slowly finding himself a great rival in fellow Belgian Albert van Damme. Berten van Damme was the antithesis of de Vlaeminck. Where Erik would glide over obstacles like they weren't even there, Berten would plough straight through them, working through on sheer power. The story of Berten van Damme is one for another day, but their rivalry is a constant throughout both of their careers. During his first year in the Rainbow Bands, Erik's big win would be a first Belgian national title, and that would be his only title that year. In a sordid Zurich, Renato Longo would claim a 5th world title. De Vlaeminck would finish 5th on the day, 11 minutes down and the last rider on the lead lap. Don't fret though, as 12 months later the rainbow bands would be back on De Vlaeminck's shoulders again. In fact, there would be 2 De Vlaeminck world champions. Roger would win the amateur race too. In Luxembourg, Erik is simply a cut above the rest. He'd put 3 minutes into his nearest rivals Greitner and Pelchat. Erik would also take another 23 victories, but the Belgian title would go into the pocket of Van Damme. An injured Erik couldn't take part, Roger holding the family honour high in second, as once again the foundations of that Van Damme-De Vlaeminck rivalry were really starting to take shape. It's a testament to Erik's career that the 1969 season, in which he'd become world champion for the 3rd time, isn't that interesting from his career perspective. He'd beat Rolf Wolfshol and Renato Longo to claim that world title. He'd also claim back the Belgian title from Van Damme and win 14 more crosses. It is however the 1970 season that is the next real interesting point in the career of De Vlaeminck. He would take 10 victories that year, but curiously did not start the Belgian nationals. A crash had caused an infection in his knee, and Roger would again be the one to take the fight to Berten. By the Worlds, Erik was healed, sort of. In Zolder, De Vlaeminck and Van Damme would have their first true war. As Van Damme flew off the line, quickly it was just him, Erik, Roger and Wolfshol. As Roger De Vlaeminck gets dropped, Wolfshol slips away, it's down to the 2, and Berten Van Damme or Erik De Vlaeminck will be world champion. Coming through the final sand passage, De Vlaeminck takes a gap. Surely he has a 4th world title in the bag. But maybe he doesn't quite. I'll let the man himself describe what happens next.
Ik viel stil. Ik voelde dan niet dat er zoveel wind stond boven de hoofden van de toeschouwers. En ik steek mijn handen in de lucht. Ik had nog 2 velers voor. En er komt zo ineens een ram op mij. Ik was dat bijna verloren. Het scheelde maar 2 bandlengtes.
To this day, this is the closest finish to a World Championships ever. De Vlaeminck had a 4th world title. He was now 1 shy of Longo and Dufresne, the record holders with 5 world titles. They were very much in sight now. And with that record in sight, De Vlaeminck would become unstoppable. For the next 2 years, Erik wins 37 times, including 2 more Belgian titles, and in Apeldoorn in 1971 he wins a 5th world title too. He's amongst the greatest now, and 12 months later in Prague, oh you better believe he wins again, an unprecedented 6th world title. He is to this day the only male rider to have won more than 5 world titles, and whilst Erik should have been basking in his glory, his mind would instead be somewhere else. On the 15th of March 1971, Jean-Pierre Montserrat, the road world champion at the time and close friend of both Erik and Roger De Vlaeminck, would be hit by a car during the Grote Jahrmarktprijs near Lille. He is killed on the spot, and the news of his death hits the De Vlaeminck family incredibly hard. Montserrat was Roger's second in command and a good friend of both brothers. Throughout 1971 and 72, Erik begins to fall into a deep depression, the accident being the catalyst. The 1972-73 season really becomes a struggle for Erik. He takes a large break, and on his return the rumours are abound that he is struggling with an alcohol addiction. Erik would deny any addiction but admit to his unprofessional behaviour, saying that it had been a tough time and that understandably his close friend's death had affected him greatly. However, he also aimed to be back to his best as soon as possible. The first test of where his ability was would come at the Belgian Nationals, and the results were very worrying. Van Damme would lap all but 3 competitors, whilst Erik would fail to finish, crashing out. At the Worlds 3 weeks later, there would only be one favourite, and it certainly wasn't the 6-time world champion. As the race gets underway, held in Crystal Palace Park in London, much like in Zolder a few years back, It's Erik, Berten and Rolf Wolfshol. This time the fourth man hanging on, however, is Frenchman André Wilhelm. The Vlaeminck is putting in a surprising performance to hold on, as Wilhelm gets dropped and then Wolfshol punctures. It's suddenly down to 2, until Erik does this. Performing what Berten van Damme would describe as a miracle, Erik flies up this ridiculously steep hill. He'd chosen a smaller gear set and he'd combined that with his ridiculous steering ability to be the only rider who was able to ride this hill. By the end of the race, it would come down to a sprint between the Vlaeminck, Wilhelm and Wolfshol, Van Damme's spirit broken by once again being bested by his compatriot. And in that sprint, there would only ever be one winner. Erik de Vlaeminck is a 7-time world champion at only 28 years of age. However, the 1973-1974 season, he would never really get going, and he wouldn't take a single victory throughout the year. Erik does not even contest the World Championships, once again leaving that responsibility to his brother Roger. By the next winter though, Erik is back at his peak, smashing into double-figure victories. Alongside Roger, the two dominate, even taking a 1-2 at the Belgian Nationals, Erik being second. As the World Championships approached, the brothers hatched a plan to claim the world title back into their household. The aim would be to get Erik an 8th world title. Roger would attack early on, allowing his brother to sit back and launch over the top. It would take roughly 500 metres for the plan to completely fail, as Roger crashes and is held up, and whilst he is working his way back to the front, Erik decides to just gun it. A plan that would not really work very well. By lap 2, Erik is caught by Van Damme, Albert Zweifel and the resurgent Roger. Roger takes the lead, heading off on his own. Maybe the plan can still work. Behind, Van Damme drops the young Swiss Zweifel, and Erik is just about able to chase on, until something slightly bizarre happens. Whilst running along with Zweifel, Erik suddenly stops dead in his tracks. But it's not because of some unforeseen injury to his muscles, not cramp, not anything like that, no. Erik's dentures had fallen out. He stopped to look for them, and that cost him the chance at victory. His morale was shattered that day, and Erik would finish 4th, as Roger de Vlaeminck would become world champion. And it's almost as if Erik's morale never really recovered from this point. He would again fall onto hard times, interspersed by moments of success. 75-76, he would barely race. 76-77 on the other hand, he'd win 13 crosses and take bronze at the Worlds, his final World Championships medal. The next year he was again absent as the Swiss started to dominate the sport. Erik de Vlaeminck would ride his final World Championships in 1979, a race that he would fail to finish. That season saw 8 victories for Erik. The following year, 1979-1980, would be his last, rounding off a stellar career with 7 victories in a somewhat subdued state. Erik's final victory would be the cyclocross in Zelzate, just down the road from his home in Eeklo. It would be his 206th career victory. Much like brother Roger's exploits in cyclocross, Erik was a very competent road cyclist too. Despite never reaching the heights of his brother in the discipline, Erik has to his name a host of victories across the Benelux. Those include the Belgian Tour. He's also podiumed in the E3 Prize, the Flèche Wallonne and Gent-Wevelgem. Erik's crowning achievement on the road comes through the 1968 Tour de France, where he would win the second stage. Following on from Erik's retirement in 1980, he would take a more private approach to life, but rumours of partying and wild antics were never far away. By 1989, Erik was handed a lifeline. Belgian cyclocross had been in a bit of a dark place itself. The title hadn't been Belgian since Liberton in '84. The only medal in that time had been Denny de Bee's shock silver in 1987. Belgian cross needed Erik, and Erik needed Belgian cross. And so, Erik de Vlaeminck became the national coach of Belgium. During his 13-year reign from 1989 to 2002, Belgium would go through a massive improvement. the Vlaeminck heralding a golden age of Belgian cyclocross, with the country producing 6 world titles and numerous super talents that would dominate the early 2000s too. Erik de Vlaeminck would retire as national coach after achieving a grand sweep of the podium at the 2002 World Championships in Zolder. And I think it's fair to say, as far as a coach is concerned, Erik is the greatest there ever has been. Unfortunately, drama would never be too far away for Erik. Whilst in the 90s he would be having immense success, he would once again face massive loss too. During a race in 1993 in Heist-op-den-Berg, Erik was acting as the national coach. His son Geert was racing. The 26-year-old was the Belgian amateur champion and seemed to be blossoming into a talent like his father. On the second lap of the race, Geert would suffer what is presumed to have been a heart attack. Despite the best efforts of the available medical crews, Geert would pass away that day, the 11th of October 1993. He was 26 years old. Erik and Roger had often had a fractured relationship too. They often competed against each other, and from around the 80s onwards, the two would rarely speak. Their rift would even split the family around them. Family gatherings rarely, if ever, happened. In February 2015, in the lead up to that year's World Championships in Tabor, Roger revealed that Erik was suffering from both Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's. In his slowly deteriorating state, the brothers would go some way to making amends and fixing their relationship. On the 4th of December 2015, Erik de Vlaeminck would pass away. He was 70 years old. Rudy de Bie, Erik's successor as national coach, put into words what this loss meant in a way that I never could. His passing is a loss for Belgian cycling as a whole. Erik was not just a grand champion, he was also simply a good man, somebody whose heart would beat for cycling, with enormous passion for cross. He has helped countless young riders reach immense success. In a way, even today's cross is built from his foundations. Erik would have a private funeral in his hometown of Eeklo. The town would also play host to an exhibition showcasing the achievements of one of its most famous residents. After masterminding an all-Belgian podium at the World Championships for only the second time ever at Zolder in 2002, the course was named after Erik. The Grote Prijs Erik de Vlaeminck has been held every year since 2008, being part of the World Cup between 2008 and 2019, and since 2020 the race has been part of the Super Prestige. During his 18-year career, Erik would win a total of 206 crosses. None of the major competitions in cyclocross had even been conceived during Erik's time as a professional, but his record in races such as Eeklo, Overijse, Middelkerke, Gavere and Niel indicate his obvious immense ability. At national level, Erik would amass 6 medals, a bronze, a silver and 4 gold, and thus 4 Belgian titles. In 1972, Erik achieved his 6th world title, an amount that put him alone as the rider with the most world titles in cross history. He would of course add a 7th in 1973. The Vlaeminck's record of 7 world titles would stand unattested for 41 years, until Marianne Vos would achieve her 7th title in Hoge Heide in 2014. Another 7 years later, and Vos took an 8th title in Fayetteville in the USA in 2022. Erik de Vlaeminck is still far and away the most successful male crosser as far as world championships are concerned. Erik was famous for his technical ability. Even the usually abrasive and self-aggrandizing Roger will admit to Erik being technically the most gifted bike rider he has ever seen. It's often hard to compare athlete to cross eras. Every sport has changed between the 70s and now. Cross 50 years ago would make even the muddiest modern crossers look like a road crit by comparison. But when you watch Erik de Vlaeminck, you see a modern crosser. A rider that, was he born in the 90s, would now probably be amongst the most technically proficient of the lot. During the time of Erik de Vlaeminck, barriers were not yet a thing. Nonetheless, he is arguably the inventor of jumping the barriers. It was Erik who guided Danny DeBee, the man who popularised it at the 1989 World Championships, in how to achieve it. DeBee in his turn inspired then children Bart Wellens and Sven Nys to master the technique, and that was what popularised it and turned it into the essential skill it is now. Try as Wellens, Nys or DeBee might though, they would always have to jump the barriers in a somewhat mechanical style, front wheel first, then second. Erik would simply glide over the barriers, like there was an invisible ramp in the way. This ability is something we're only just seeing now with riders like Mathieu van der Poel and Tom Pidcock regularly achieving it, on their ultra lightweight purpose-built cross machines. Erik did it 70 years ago on a steel bicycle. That's how good he was. To call Erik de Vlaeminck a legend is simply not enough. Erik is the legend. He is the first true legend of cyclocross. Some huge figures came in the sport before him, but none of them had the legacy, the impact that Erik had. Erik is the first rider to truly capture the imagination of the public, to build a legacy that people would build on from. He was the first figure to truly become larger than life, and his 7 world titles is a record that will on the men's side almost certainly never be broken. Erik is the first great titan of cyclocross, and depending on who you ask, he is still the biggest. He is the shoulder on which giants stand, the biggest giant of them all.